Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It is my great honor to welcome to the stage our distinguished host, the leader of Mr. Robert Zimmer, the president of the University of Chicago, one of the great academic and research institutions on the planet. Bob is a close friend and a distinguished scholar. Robert Zimmer is an American mathematician and a distinguished academic administrator. He's the 13th president of the University of Chicago and serves as the chair of the board of Argonne National Lab, Fermi National Accelerator Lab, and the Marine Biological Laboratory. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to President Robert Zimmer.
Thank you very much, Tom, and let me welcome all of you to the University of Chicago. So this, of course, is the annual gathering of the Siebel Scholars. This is actually the third time this event has taken place here at the University of Chicago, and that is reflective of the strong partnership that we've had with Tom. I just wanted to say one word about Tom, which he might not necessarily be prepared for, but I think that this gathering and the entire effort around the Siebel Scholars is a very important thing to understand, which is that Tom, after extraordinary success in business, turned this incredible energy and incredible focus to a combination of addressing the most important problems of our times and doing that in part through the creation and recognition of outstanding leaders and future leaders who are going to be the people who are going to be addressing these issues. And the energy and focus that he has brought to this is truly extraordinary, and I think it's reflected in the extraordinary quality of the individuals who are gathered here today and the accomplishments that many of them have already made and that many of them are poised to make. So I just want to recognize Tom's extraordinary work and what it is that is reflected in our being here together today. So the topic today, of course, is quite an interesting one. And of course, the best part of this is the tagline of what could possibly go wrong. And what at least seemed to start in many ways as a relatively simple way of a new way of having the digital computer provide different types of ways of people to, one, express themselves and two, get together, has turned out to have just vast ramifications in an astonishing array of questions. And we see this almost every day, and whether the questions involve the nature of business and companies, economic issues, the structure of democracy, the nature of politics in the United States and around the world, the evolution of social behavior, the neurological impact, the individual impact. The array of this is almost astonishingly vast, and it's almost astonishing to imagine just how impactful what seems like a rather innocent thing at the beginning is. It is indeed a vast world of perhaps unintended consequences, at least sometimes unintended, but not always. One of the great things about the group that's assembled to talk about this is that they have rather different viewpoints, come at this from different angles, and you'll see overlapping interests where the perspectives may be different, perspectives may come together to yield new insights. And so I just also want to recognize the extraordinary panel that's collected here and the different perspectives that they represent. I think one of the things that's so important about that is that, in fact, complex issues demand being looked at from multiple perspectives. And that's what we're going to see today. So thank you all very much for being here. Again, I want to thank the panel, and particularly want to thank Tom, without whom we would not be here. So please enjoy the day and have a very productive time. Thank you very much.
First, kind of let's cover the agenda, and then I want to talk about the rules of engagement. And before I do that, I want to lob a Molotov cocktail into this room. And I think that we had a fascinating discussion on Cambridge Analytica last night. And, but I think that many of us in the room are really not aware of what the Cambridge Analytica issue is all about. So this morning on my way here, I went on to one of my favorite sources of fake news. There is no news but fake news, right? And this happens to be Wikipedia. It's as good as any. And I just, I wanted to read you the entry just to liven up this conversation a little bit. Cambridge Analytica Limited was a British consulting firm which combined data mining, data brokerage, and data analysis with strategic communications during the electoral process. It was started in 2013 as an offshoot of SCL Group. The company closed operations in 2018 in the course of the Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal, although related firms still exist. The company was partly owned by the family of Robert Mercer, an American hedge fund manager who supports many politically conservative causes. The firm maintained offices in London, New York City, Washington, D.C. CEO Alexander Nix has said Cambridge Analytica was involved in 44 U.S. political races in 2014. In 2015, Cambridge Analytica performed data analysis services for Ted Cruz's presidential campaign. In 2016, Cambridge Analytica worked for Donald Trump's presidential campaign, as well as for Leave.eu, one of the organizations that campaigned in the United Kingdom's referendum on European Union membership. Cambridge Analytica's role in those campaigns has been controversial and is the subject of ongoing criminal investigations in both countries. Political scientists question Cambridge Analytica's claims about the effectiveness of its methods of targeting voters. In March 2018, multiple media outlets broke news of Cambridge Analytica's business practices. The New York Times and The Observer reported that the company had acquired and used personal data about Facebook users from an external researcher who had told Facebook who told Facebook he was collecting it for academic purposes. Shortly afterwards, Channel 4 News aired undercover investigative videos showing Nix boasting about using prostitutes, bribery sting operations, and honey traps to discredit politicians on whom it conducted opposition research, saying that the company ran all of Donald Trump's digital campaign. In response to the media reports, the Information Commissioner's Office of the UK pursued a warrant to search the company's servers. Facebook banned Cambridge Analytica from advertising on its platform, saying it had been deceived. In March 2018, the British High Court granted the ICO a warrant to search Cambridge Analytica's London offices. The personal data of up to 87 million Facebook users were acquired via the 270,000 Facebook users who used a Facebook app called This Is Your Digital Life. By giving this third-party app permission to acquire their data back in 2015, this also gave the app access to the information on the user's friends network. This resulted in the data of about 87 million users, the majority of whom had not explicitly given Cambridge Analytica permission to access their data being collected. This app developer breached Facebook's terms of service by giving the data to Cambridge Analytica. On May 2018, Cambridge Analytica and its parent company filed for insolvency proceedings and closed operations. And then it kind of goes on. You can read the rest of it. Anyhow, the story has a little bit of color to it. Now, this morning we're going to talk about the art and science of persuasive technologies, and Rana is going to go up here in a minute and lead a lively conversation with B.J. Fogg, Sherry Turkle, and Shoshana Zuboff. This afternoon, we'll open a dialogue about the political and social implications of social media, if any, and that conversation again will be led by Rana and Alex Kogan, Karl Rove, and Jean Twenge. Let me talk at the end of this, okay, on Sunday, we're going to get together in work groups the way we will, and I'm not certain what the assignment algorithms is by which you'll be collected into work groups, whatever it is, okay? Okay, and but we are going to ask you to go off and come back and deliver us a work product within 30 days. And this work product from each work group will be a few pages of suggestions that we will then, as it relates to what, if anything, should our government be doing about these issues? As it relates to regulatory policy, whether it relates to antitrust, whatever it might be, and maybe the right thing to do is nothing. I don't know, but we're going to collect that series of recommendations. We're going to edit them, and then we're going to publish them, and then we're going to provide them to Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy and Chuck Schumer and McConnell in the Senate, and I assure you they will be read. So I encourage you to give some thought as these conversations take place today, and you will be participating in these conversations today, but we're going to provide this work product to the leaders of this House, leaders of the Congress, and it will be read. Okay, now, rules of engagement. Open, vigorous, sometimes impassioned debate. We're going to engage today in an open, vigorous, and sometimes impassioned debate about an important and controversial subject. And I really, or at least many of the people in the room, have a vested interest in this subject. Circumspection, candor, rigor, honesty, and political incorrectness are encouraged, okay? Interpersonal discourtesy or intolerance of mutually exclusive perspectives on these issues will not be tolerated, okay? This is not going to happen, okay? And with that in mind, we expect and hope for a full contact debate in the next 2 days. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rana to the stage. Rana.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thanks to all of you for being here. My boss from the FT just called and said he wants to hire you as a fact checker, Tom, so just be ready. I am delighted to be here. I want to just reiterate what Tom said. This is going to be a really interactive discussion. I'm going to introduce this first panel in just a moment, and we're going to chat for 20 or 30 minutes ourselves. But then we're going to bring all of you in. And we really want you to join in this debate. There are folks with mics around the room, so when I open it up, just grab my eye, raise your hand, be thinking of your questions, and really help us to make this the broadest and most interesting debate that it can be. So with that, let me welcome to the stage our panelists. First, Sherry Turkle, who is director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self, as well as a wonderful author and a long-time healthy critic of technology. Next, I'm going to invite to the stage BJ Fogg, who is a behavioral scientist at Stanford and has done a tremendous amount of work in this field and really coined the phrase persuasive technology, which we're going to talk to him about. Come on up. And finally, Shoshana Zuboff, who is the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism and a longtime professor at the Harvard Business School, and she is going to help set the stage for us in this debate. Come on up.
Thank you.
So we have a lot of ground to cover, but the great news is we have a lot of time. This is like the most time on a panel I've ever moderated, so we're going to be able to do this well. As I was listening to Tom and Bob and reflecting on the title of our first panel, The Art and Science of Persuasive Technologies, but also the title of this whole conference, Social Media, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? Those two topics alone are really big, but actually they're not the biggest topics. They're not the broadest tent, actually, for what we're talking about here. And I teed up Shoshana, and I think, Shoshana, I'm actually going to start with you because for those of you who haven't read Shoshana's book, you got to read it. As a matter of fact, it's going to be required reading if it isn't already on pretty much every syllabus in every university, I suspect. Your work has been very influential to me in my own writing at the FT and in a book I've just come out with. And I think that you've done the best job of anybody at describing the age of surveillance capitalism, which is really encompassing everything that we're talking about here, the economic, the political, which we're going to come back to quite a lot this afternoon, but the social, the cultural, the emotional. So I want to give you a few minutes to just tell us what surveillance capitalism is and why is it different?
So wonderful to be here today. Thank you, Rana, such a kind introduction. Thank you, Tom, and all these beautiful young people in the world, in this room. I'm so happy to be here with you. This is the paperback version that just came out in London, but I wanna just read you one little thing. I dedicated this book to my husband and a dear friend, but I really dedicated it to my children. And what I said, my children are in their 20s, so they're your age, and what I said was, I write to fortify your futures and the moral cause of your generation. If it wasn't for thinking of my kids' futures and your futures, I don't think I could have spent 7 years in my pajamas writing this book, because that's pretty much what it took. So let's talk a little bit about surveillance capitalism. The overall thesis here is that, we keep talking about technology. Technology is not the subject, and technology is not the problem. Technology is the puppet. But economics is the puppet master. We entered the digital century believing that this was going to be the golden age of empowerment, of the democratization of knowledge. And at first, all the indicators seemed bright. You remember that term, disintermediation? The whole idea was that the digital was going to, bypass the old institutional boundaries. This was eventually kind of epitomized in the iPod. You don't have to buy the business model of the CD. You can get whatever song you want, and we bring the assets directly to you, where you want it, how you want it, and so forth. Disintermediation was going to be the thing that empowered us and drove assets, but importantly drove information to every corner. That didn't last very long. And the thing is that the fact that it didn't last very long was hidden from most of us. what happened very quickly was that the digital, this whole layer of the digital, the devices from our computers and our laptops, eventually our phones, and now the cameras, the sensors, the IoT, all the devices that saturate our lives, were quickly inhabited by another force that came in stealth. This is the Trojan horse model. The digital became the Trojan horse for a new economic logic. Very quickly, there was a new middleman, and I'm using that word judiciously because at the beginning anyway, a lot of the young people who were creating this new economics were men. So we went from disintermediation to remediation very, very quickly. And the new middleman now between us and the digital, and between us and those assets that we hunger for, from knowledge to songs, that new middleman was surveillance capitalism. Born in the heat of financial emergency during the dot-com bust at Google, it was a wholly new approach to the seminal pattern of capitalist evolution. So that pattern of evolution has been, capitalism grows by identifying things that live outside the market dynamic, bringing them into the market dynamic, turning them into what we call commodities, things that can be sold and purchased. As everybody in this room knows, industrial capitalism famously did this by taking nature, bringing it into the market dynamic, the meadows, the rivers, the forests, turning it into land and real estate that could be sold and purchased. It took a couple of centuries of scientific development for us to understand the havoc that we have inherited as a result of those long-term processes of industrial capitalism. Now we have a new form of capitalism emerging at a moment in the globalization process where commodification has run rampant. It seems like everything that can be commodified has been commodified. Companies all over the world are chasing revenues, profit, chasing margins, looking from where this final value-added advantage is going to come from. It was at Google that they made the ascertainment that private human experience was the last virgin wood. And this economic logic was founded on the notion that, yes, we're going to take something that lives outside the market dynamic, bring it into the market, and turn it into a commodity that can be sold and purchased. But in this case, with a dark and startling turn. Because the thing they targeted was private human experience. Repurposing private human experience as free raw material for new processes of production and sales. Specifically, private human experience valued for its rich predictive signals, unilaterally claimed and translated into behavioral data. Now, at first, a lot of behavioral data, some behavioral data was used to improve products and services. At Google, there was Translate. At Google, there was, autocomplete, various products and services that riffed off of those behavioral data. But in the heat of financial emergency, when even their own venture capitalists were threatening to pull out, the Google founders decided that they were going to double down on advertising, which had before then been a denigrated and peripheral operation within the company. To do that, they went to what they were then calling data exhaust. These were leftover data, more than what was needed for product and service improvement, haphazardly stored. But it had been recognized that these data exhaust harbored rich, predictive signals that became powerful predictors of future human behavior. And it was through now taking over the servers, the storage of this data exhaust, analyzing it deeply, moving it into the already frontier computational capabilities that Google had even as a fledgling company. Even then, back in 2000, 2001, they called it their AI. And out of that, discovering that they could create predictions of human behavior. And they could sell those predictions of human behavior not to so-called users. The data came from people, but it didn't go back to people. It was about people, but it wasn't used to serve people. The idea now was that these predictions of human behavior could be used to sell in a new kind of marketplace to business customers with a keen interest in knowing what we would do soon and later. Who were these first business customers? They were their online targeted advertisers, to whom they said, look, the whole history of advertising, you've been deciding where your ads go. We're going to end that. We've got a black box of computational analysis. Out of this black box comes a prediction about where you should put your ad. We're calling it the click-through rate. You do what the black box says, you'll make more money, we'll make more money, everybody will be happy. At first, the advertisers said, we don't like a black box, but eventually they agreed. The upshot is the first globally successful prediction product was the click-through rate. And it was sold into a new kind of marketplace. And all you have to do is zoom out a little bit to see that that new kind of marketplace is a market that trades exclusively in human futures. We have markets that trade in pork belly futures. We have markets that trade in wheat futures and oil price futures. We now have markets that trade in human futures. And those markets began with online targeted advertising. They spread throughout the tech sector, but they now travel through the normal economy, virtually around the globe, whether it's insurance and retail, health, education, finance, transportation, all the way back, interestingly, to the Ford Motor Company, where the CEO of the Ford Motor Company, searching for those margins in a world where no one anywhere in the world is buying cars the way they used to. So what you would like the CEO of Ford Motor to be doing is he here by any chance? I should just
Is there anyone from Ford here?
What you'd like the CEO of Ford Motor Company to be doing in the face of slumping auto sales is to say, you know what? We're going to take all the genius of this company. We're going to take all the capital of this company. We're going to figure out how to create an automobile that doesn't burn carbon. That's what Henry Ford would have been doing. Believe me, I'm not extolling Henry Ford. He was a bastard in just about every way.
Yeah, yeah.
But he was, did I violate the interpersonal norms?
No,
but,
you're good. He's dead.
But he was, oh, okay, a fair game, Henry. But he made economic history, and so, you know, that's the part I'm going with. That's what Henry Ford would have done. Instead, what today's CEO of Ford says is, you know what? We need investors. I can't get those investors unless I can get PEs, market capitalization like Google and Facebook. How am I going to do that? Ah, I've got an idea. There are 100 million people driving around in Ford vehicles. We stream data from all those people while they're in our cars. Then we combine it with the data we already have from Ford Credit, where he says, we already know everything about you. Now he says, we're on an equal playing field with Google and Facebook. What investor would not want to come to us? So what I'm describing to you is what I call the surveillance dividend. The surveillance dividend is what's driving the market capitalization of these companies and what is driving companies from every sector into the model of this economic logic. I'm going to stop by saying this one last sentence, of just a bookmark that we can come back to.
Yeah.
A lot of what I've done in this book is to reverse engineer the competitive dynamics of markets that trade in human futures. I have come to the conclusion, and we can go into the details during our discussion, but just to say, I'll give you the conclusion, that the reliable, inevitable, and predictable dynamics of such competitive markets are as pernicious and dangerous and threatening to human freedom and the prospects of a democratic society as are markets that trade in human slaves or markets that trade in human organs. That's where we are now. And these are the problems that all of us together have to solve.
Whew. Well, you can see now why I wanted Shoshana to set the stage for you, because that is the breadth of what we're talking about here. And you know, I'm beginning to think that 57 minutes is actually not a lot. There's a tremendous amount in what you said. And before I move on to give other panelists some airtime, I want to bookmark a few things in there.
Okay.
I love, in part because my first book was about financialization, I love the comparisons that you're making between big tech, surveillance capitalism, and the financial sector. The black box terminology is very interesting because it gets at something I'd like to tease out more with you and the rest of the panelists in terms of the asymmetry, not only of the transaction, but of the power dynamic. And power is something that I hope we're going to talk about. And I think it's going to be talked about a lot in the election cycle in 2020. I mean, this is, when we're at Chicago, we're talking about economics as well at Chicago. Power has been left out of the economic equation for some time, and I think that we should think about that in this panel and in our next one too. I also want to bookmark the idea of the dividend, the digital dividend, which
surveillance dividend.
Sorry, surveillance dividend. There's also a digital dividend, which we'll maybe get to. But the surveillance dividend, which is important, there's a lot of research just showing how incredibly valuable that micro-targeting is. And you're right that every single company, I've been a business reporter for 30 years, every single company is doing this. And all too often, actually, the conversation is just about a handful of tech companies. And you're right that Google is the perfect narrative. I looked at it in my book as well, because they were sort of there at the beginning and figured out this model. But Starbucks is doing this. J&J is doing this. You know, your bank is doing this. Your healthcare company is doing this. So it's everywhere. So this is not just a conversation about big tech. The other thing I want to bookmark, and actually I'm going to use this as a segue, I think, BJ, to you to get your input. Shoshana, you're telling the Google narrative. I tell some of the Google narrative in my book. If you go back to Google's original paper on search in 1998 that Larry and Sergey did, there's an interesting, at the very end, like on page 36 or something, there's an appendix that talks about what would it mean to have a privately run search engine, a search engine that is essentially, the business model is targeted data and advertising. What would that mean? And they actually said that this model would be vulnerable to misuse or, you know, to selfish use by not only companies and private sector actors, but by public sector actors. And that's something I'm going to explore later with you, Alex, on the next panel. But I think we should bookmark that. And BJ, I want to, I guess, open it up. I want to hear your definition of persuasive technology, because you coined the term. But I want to actually ask you a kind of a bigger question to segue from what Shoshana said. You're at Stanford. You've been in the Valley. You've been an entrepreneur. You've been in industry. You've been in the hub of, you know, the birthplace of surveillance capitalism. We knew in 1998 that there were problems with this. I mean, you know, any number of people in the field, Roger McNamee, who's a source and, you know, many people know of, has flagged this. Why are we still up here kind of just trying to define the problem? Why has it taken so long?
You know, I don't know why it's taken so long. You're right in that 1998, I put out the first paper in academic circles saying, hey, there's this thing, I think I called it persuasive computing in that paper.
By the way, I was talking about the Google paper, but yeah, tell me about yours.
Yeah, so my first paper into the Chi community, which is the main community for human-computer interaction, And it wasn't a big paper, it was like a workshop or something on the side. And I said, hey, people, there's this thing going on, let's talk about it. And I drew this in the paper, and it's also in my book, Persuasive Technology, these two circles. One circle is this world of persuasion and influence that goes back, you know, to the rhetoricians and social psychology and all of that. The other circle is technology, you know, and I put mobile and other things in there. And it's like this overlap now exists, and it's going to get bigger and bigger, and there's opportunities and there's serious dark sides. And so there's more along those lines. But to your question, in the definition, the way I defined it, I went through a bunch of different terms because that was the whole reason I went to Stanford as a doctoral student. I became interested in this idea. I foresaw by reading little books in French on rhetoric. I was trying to learn French. I was living in the south of France reading these little, it's almost like Cliff Notes books. And I was like, oh my gosh, this stuff that they're talking about, classical rhetoric is going to happen in technology. Wow, that's really interesting. That's what I want to really study.
Wait, slow that down for a minute. How did you make that connection? What year was this, and how?
It was
tell us a little more
probably
about that.
1991 or 1992.
Okay.
So I'd done an undergraduate degree, I'd done a master's degree where I did a lot of work in linguistics and rhetoric, and I thought I was going to go do a PhD in rhetoric because I loved it. I loved what was going on in the field at the time. And I decided I want to learn French and just went to France, didn't know anybody, embedded myself in the culture, didn't talk to anybody in English, you know, and just immersed. And so I just read constantly in French. And so read these little books that you get. It's called Que sais-je, or some, I probably can't say it right.
Que sais-je.
There we go, thank you so much, yes. Cute little, really great series. And so one's about communication, rhetoric, and so on. And there was just something about reading that. And then I come from a background of family that's very tech forward. My father's an eye surgeon, and apparently with eye surgeons, they're very like into gadgets and stuff. I guess it used to go with things. And so I had a computer really early. My dad built his own computer in the office in his home office before you could buy them. So for me, it was pretty natural to go, wow, this thing about influencing people and technology, I thought it overlapped already, but I thought, this is an interesting overlap. That's what I want to do for my PhD. So in applying to PhD programs, I wrote about that. And then I hadn't considered Stanford because they didn't have a rhetoric program. And then one of my friends, no, long story, but I did. And when I got admitted there, I looked at the group that I'd be researching with, and it was called Computers as Social Actors. So this was Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves. And I looked at what they were doing, and I didn't realize, I was so naive, I didn't realize I was shifting from the humanities to the social sciences, and it was a dramatic shift. But that was great, so I went there and became an experimental psychologist, social science, true experiments, under the framework of what they were investigating is humans are responding to technology as though that computer were alive and interesting. And a lot of people thought it was crazy, but we were doing experiments that showed, wow, that seems to be the case. What I brought to that research lab, I was interested in, it was basically Cialdini's work. So I was grounded in Cialdini's work, not operant conditioning, not behaviorism, but Cialdini's work of social psychology. And I wanted to see if you could replicate the social influence principles with computers. So if you interact with a computer that you think is your teammate, will you behave in more team-like ways, and so on. So there's a set of those principles. And so that's what I went to do, and I ran the experiments there, and it's like, yep, the same kind of dynamics that have been found for decades, human to human, now play out human to computer. In presenting the work, initially people were like, no, your data's wrong. People don't have emotions with computers. People aren't doing this, but it's like, and after doing enough of those studies, and it was pretty overwhelmingly obvious, but it took the Tamagotchi as a product to finally convince people, because they weren't really, they didn't buy into the studies. There's always questions about the data and all that. And then when the Tamagotchi hit, and somebody's daughter was crying because the little pet died, then they went, then the resistance to that line of research stopped. Well, so I was bringing the persuasion piece. That's what I was interested in, interpersonal persuasion, and could computers do that? And I thought, well, why don't we name this? And I named it a bunch of things. And I think it was 1996 that I settled on, I think I shifted back and forth between persuasive computing and persuasive technology. And it's essentially using computers or technology to change people's beliefs and behaviors. But it was persuasion, not coercion, not deception. So I drew a pretty clear line. We're talking persuasion here, which is not the same as manipulation, coercion, deception. And so that's how I define persuasive technology.
Can you, before I ask a follow-up and move on to Sherry, can you just tell folks who don't know what the Persuasion Lab does at Stanford, a little bit about you know, the kinds of classes you teach, some of the things that have come out of it? Just give us a bit of a background.
The size and popularity and impact of the persuasive technology has been vastly exaggerated by bloggers and people writing about it. I think some people would be delighted. It's like, oh, but in fact, it's a very teeny operation. One day, somebody gave me a corner of an office in CSLI, and that was my lab. And the students liked working with me, so we wouldn't actually meet in a physical space. We'd meet in Treseder. And what we wanted to do was further define the field and do some interesting experiments. And so we didn't have huge grants or anything. I mean, my lab has almost never paid anybody to be there. So what I learned early is how to run a lab and do projects that are so cool that students are willing just to work on them without being paid. And sometimes I give credit, but not always. And that's a great filter. If a project doesn't have students interested, to me it's like sunset the project and pick something else. So the Persuasive Technology Lab kind of started, it was pretty much kind of like a startup within Stanford. It wasn't like anybody said, here, BJ, here's your funding, start a lab, here's your room, here's your students. It's a startup. It was very much like that. And then one thing led to another, and I remember putting up posters in this, I was trying to make people aware of this persuasive technology thing. And so my teaching at Stanford is a different thing than the lab. So I taught for computer science until about 2012. Now I teach for the School of Education. And then I run the lab. Those are separate things. And they connect in some ways. In about 2009, our interests changed, both my teaching and what my students, and then we recognized by 2010 what we were doing, we would no longer consider persuasive technology. So in 2011, we started calling the lab the Behavior Design Lab. Not the same thing as persuasive technology, although people say, oh, it's just a new name. It's not. And so since about 2010, 2011, I refer to my lab as the Behavior Design Lab, and it's really not about technology necessarily. It's about how human behavior works more generally, and we're especially interested in things like health behaviors, getting people out to nature, reducing screen time. Right now we're teaching about climate change. So,
okay,
yeah.
And we've had this conversation before. You started because you wanted to give people, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, you started thinking about this because you wanted to bring persuasion into technology, started with rhetoric, persuasion, technology, in order to get, as you say, create more healthy lifestyles, give people nudges about nutrition or not smoking or whatever it was. But these persuasive technologies are also used in ways that keep people online longer and allow their data to be harvested for surveillance capitalism. How do you look at that now in retrospect? When you wrote your book in 2002, would you have imagined we were going to be where we are?
It was even before that. In 1998, the Association of Computing Machinery, ACM, invited me to be the guest editor for their monthly publication that would go out into not even just the Chi community, but all of ACM, which is a big deal. And so I put together a series of articles, mostly my students, because who else knows about persuasive technology? And I think they called it persuasive computing on the cover. And one of those was about the ethics of this space, which I still think is one of the, and it was written by, I think they were sophomores. Daniel Verdichevsky and Eric Wunschwander, and I still think it's one of the best pieces ever written on the ethics of this space. And so certainly early, seeing that there's a dark side to it, absolutely. What I did not anticipate in the book, because I pretty much wrote it like 1999, 2000, 2001, was the book was not about computer-mediated communication. Back in the day, at that time, within the Chi community and the people that were researching and innovating, there were two really distinct camps. One was called HCI, human-computer interaction. You're interacting with a machine. Another group was CMC, computer-mediated communication, and those were quite distinct areas. And so in looking at persuasive technology and in defining this arena and in my book, I said, look, this is not about CMC, this is about HCI. So fast forward to social media, where it's this weird mix of HCI and computer-mediated communication. It's this weird mix. So I didn't anticipate that, and I certainly didn't write about that in persuasive technology.
Okay, lot to unpack, and we're going to come back in all of this. But Sherry, I'm going to come to you now. I don't even know where to start, because I've got 3 questions I can ask you. But one of the things, and I'll just come clean, I find a lot of what BJ, what you're saying fascinating, but I also find it very technical. And when we start talking about acronyms and we start kind of disengaging, let's say, a little bit from some of the human side, I find this in finance too, that the conversation can kind of go off in a direction that I find, this is just my opinion, disconnects the technology and the human. And I guess, Sherry, I'm just going to segue and see if you agree with that. And since you're looking at how humans and technology interact, and really, I mean, at the highest level, I think you're about why we're up here still talking about these things and how they're reshaping our lives. I mean, what part of this resonates for you?
Well, 2 things struck me very much, and I want to just say that when BJ talked about the Tamagotchi changed everybody's mind. People may remember what the Tamagotchi was. My studies of sociable robotics, which is a technology that really disturbs me, because basically you're talking about a field that wants to put a computer that pretends to have empathy, a computer that pretends to care about you, in the hands of people in nursing homes, as a companion to your mother, as a companion to your child. Sounds good until you remember that that computer is just pretending all those things. It passes the Turing test for pretending. But then we can get into the story of, well, why do we want something to be pretending to care for us? That's our most basic, empathy and caring is our most basic human function. Why are we so excited that we can create these pretend caring machines? But the Tamagotchi was the first one that fooled us into a relationship with it of that nature, because there was no pretense that it cared. And I'm very struck that you brought it up, because I studied those Tamagotchis and people's relationships with them and talked to Clifford Nass a lot about them. Clifford was a great friend of mine. And really, what those relationships were about was not about the smarts of that machine, because that machine had none. It was about our human vulnerability. And I think that as I've surveyed this field over these 30, 40 years, so much of this discussion about technology is really a discussion about human vulnerability and when we're offered a pretend relationship, or when we're offered a nudge, or when we're offered something that seems to make something friction-free that should not be friction-free, we want it. And then the question is, why do we want it? The technology's found a way to sort of touch that sweet spot where we're vulnerable to things that seem to make life simpler in ways that life should not be simpler. So for example, I remember being at a demo for something that thrilled people at MIT, and it was a demo for an app where you could order a coffee at Starbucks, let's say, mochaccino, frappuccino, yada, yada, and it was on the Internet of Things, so your phone would guide you to get to the Starbucks without having to pass your ex-wife, your ex-husband, the faculty member you'd had a fight with, anybody who you might have been in conflict with, you know, Republican if you were a Democrat if you were Republican. You could basically, the model was in the demo of a friction-free life, as though a friction-free life was a goal of technology. And the room went wild with appreciation that technology could offer us this friction-free life, as though that was something, a good thing that technology could do for us. And I've sort of tracked that through these years of what did technology think it could offer us? It could offer us friction-free. It could offer us less vulnerability, which is why I've spent so many years studying why people text rather than talk.
Bane of my existence.
Excuse me?
It's the bane of my existence with my children. Pick up the phone.
Yeah, well, because
Nobody picks up, well, they pick up the phone to tweet, but.
you know, and when you ask people, well, why don't you want to have a conversation? They say, a conversation, I'll tell you why I don't want to have a conversation. It takes place in real time, and you have to respond to what the other people was going to say. I mean, that's a frightening proposition. That could be hard and hurtful and make you feel vulnerable. So I think that what you, sort of my large point to sort of begin with, you know, why are we here? Why are we talking about things that, you know, touch on human values, and you sort of, when you take the big picture, is because technology has made us some offers, as in The Godfather, that we haven't known how to refuse, because they touch on human vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And we have to ask ourselves, really, is this the kind of life, you know, that we want to live?
That's fascinating. I want to ask you one quick follow-up question. Do you think there's, and we're going to hear, I think, more about this in the second panel, there's a discussion about young people and the sort of fragility that some of them exhibit going out into the world, delayed adolescence, you know, inability. Is that, do you see overlaps with surveillance capitalism, with the technology? And tell us a little more about that.
There are things that you get when you subject yourself, to use this language, to the rigor of, for example, being out there in the public square to have political conversation, personal conversation, when you're texting, not talking, that toughen you up to learning how to disagree civilly, learning how to defend your position and not take it personally and not melt, having a sense of your boundaries, having a sense of being respectful of other people's points of view. Young people today struggle with this. My work is ethnographic and clinical work, where I interview people about, you know, their strengths and weaknesses, and why conversation is hard and why conversation is difficult. And these are skills that you don't develop unless you use them. So one way that I put it is that there has been a movement from, I have a feeling, I want to make a call, which let's call that old school.
Oh, man.
You know, I have a feeling, I want to share that, to I want to have a feeling, I need to send a text.
Wow.
In other words, the feeling itself
Yeah.
is not constituted unless you are communicating by text. A sense of not even having a feeling of constituted boundaries unless you're communicating by text. In that second context, the self is so fragile, to get back to your language, that you don't even feel that sense of boundaried person feelings. You're constituting the self as you are in fact texting. That kind of self-constitution would not go that well in a conversation because you'd be shifting kind of all the time.
Okay.
Yep.
I want to stop for a minute. And by the way, we're going to open it up in just a minute and start gathering some questions, but feel free to jump in at any point, any of the panelists on this stuff. Shoshana, I want to go back to a point that you made. You rightly said that, you know, we sort of set the rules of capitalism, and you can change the rules, you can change the paradigm. Is there, I think I'm right in assuming that all of you feel that these technologies are doing some harm, even though they have the potential to do a lot of good, that they are addictive, that there is cause for alarm. Is there a way, one of the debates that I hear a lot in policy circles, there seem to be two camps. One camp seems to think, look, yeah, this stuff it's really problematic. It's had all kinds of major economic impacts, which, you know, we don't even really have time to dig into, but suffice to say, puts a lot of the problems of neoliberalism and globalization and financialization on steroids. Fair enough. There are implications for health, et cetera, but the cat's out of the bag. So that's how you frame the conversation. We just regulate what we can. We try and find these piecemeal ways to think about it. There's another aspect of this, which I think we're trying to engage with here, that, wow, we've just had a massive paradigm shift. Maybe we need to pull back and have some more profound solutions. So, Shoshana, one question I have for you is, where are the market mechanisms here to push to have a big shift in surveillance capitalism? Because frankly, the biggest lobbying group in Washington and Brussels, and I haven't even gotten to China, which is an entire, surveillance state in which, all of this is allowed and encouraged and utilized economically and socially. How can you shift things at this stage? Where do you see the levers in a world in which politics is essentially captured and the regulatory debate is largely captured?
Well, what a good question, Rana. Okay, so I would like to preface my answer to this question by suggesting that we stop using the word technology. Because I'm not saying that technology is purely neutral. In fact, my early work, back in the 80s, in the age of the smart machine, the future of work and power, and I talked about the inherent affordances of digital technology and how it doesn't only automate, it produces data and so forth. Yes, but everything that we're talking about here, it's not persuasive technology only, it's that there are persuaders who are using the technology milieu, the digital layer, to persuade. And many of the phenomenon that, the critically important phenomenon that Sherry describes, have their origins in very clear policy and design decisions intended to maximize the flow. This is a term I haven't put out there yet. Remember I told you that these extra data flows, more than what was needed for product and service, valued for their rich predictive signals. That's what I call behavioral surplus. And that's what surveillance capital essentially is built on, is the transformation of behavioral surplus, those behavioral data flows, into predictions and into market revenues. So there are very intentional engineering, design, pricing, economic decisions that are intended to maximize the flow of behavioral surplus at any cost. I could go into a lot of detail on this. I won't.
Yeah.
But what I've learned is that as a kind of discipline, if we stop calling something technology and call it, you know, call it surveillance capitalism, call it the economic force, but put it in the human realm, put it in the realm of choice, because one of the key pieces of propaganda that we're fighting against, and the surveillance capitalists have had a free 20-year run, which is going to bring me to answering your question, a free 20-year run of no law, of no impediment. It's like if anybody's been to Georgia and you see the kudzu hanging from all the trees, that's a invasive plant that has no natural predator. It takes over everything. That's what happened to the internet, now owned and operated by surveillance capitalism, to the digital in general, and to our societies and to our lives. An invasive species with no natural predator. So, all right. So let's put things back in the human, and let's put them in history, because it's in the human and in history that we start to realize, hey, remember the Wizard of Oz? You lift up that curtain, and there's just a little guy standing there. That's the world that we're in, where they have tried to persuade us with rhetorical brilliance, year after year after year, get with the program. This is how the digital future is supposed to be. When the villagers of Broughton, England came out to stop the Street View cars from getting into their village because they felt it violated their sense of sanctuary and community, John Hankey, the Street View boss, also the inventor of Google Earth, later the inventor of Pokemon Go, said, get over it. This has already been decided. The West has decided. This is how the future is going to be. But we haven't decided. And there is nothing inevitable. All right. So number one, where do the solutions come from? I have one word. They come from democracy. Right? The only way to tether a raw and violent capitalism to the interests of society, to people, and to the aspirations of a democratic future is through democratic institutions. That means that capitalism, especially when it goes off the rails, as is the case with surveillance capitalism, as was the case in the Gilded Age, and at other times in our history, is brought to heel under democratic governance. So that once again we can have something, we can have a phrase like market democracy, and it can mean something. So what does that mean? It means that we're not talking about the ethics, for God's sakes, of these developments. It was even as early as 1997, the FTC had come to the conclusion that self-regulation in the tech sector was a non-starter. It was not going to work. They were looking at the cookies. They were looking at the web bugs. They were looking at the language, share of wallet, eyeballs, and so forth. By the year 2000, 2001, there was proposals floating around Congress from the FTC for comprehensive federal privacy legislation. So we are way past a discussion about ethics. The time now is for law. Now, the reason that I'm very bullish about this, I'm very optimistic about this, is that the last 20 years have been lawless years. This economic logic has been allowed to root and flourish like that invasive plant without any impediment, with barely any law. This is why, you know, Schmidt and Cohn begin their book on the digital age. The internet, the last lawless space, they celebrate it. And this is why Sergey Brin complains about, Larry Page complains about law and says, you don't expect us to follow laws that were invented before the internet, do you? Like habeas corpus, Bill of Rights. Okay, so we're talking about law. And law has not yet begun. I learned in these rooms, back there are rooms that I used to hang out in as an undergraduate at this school, where Milton Friedman was teaching. Milton Friedman, I didn't agree with his point of view, but I was fascinated by his tactics. Milton Friedman said, you take the long view. You play the long game if you want to influence history. And he taught his students that everything begins with public opinion. Milton Friedman spent time going around to Chicago schools, spent time on high school textbooks, and going on TV and reinterpreting history for the average TV watcher and so forth. The long game begins with public opinion, the awakening of public opinion. And through that, we mobilize lawmakers and our democratic institutions. And through that, we demand. Okay, now, why is law so important in the market?
Yeah.
In the market solution? Because until we get laws that interrupt and outlaw the key mechanisms of surveillance capitalism, and by that I mean two critical things, supply and demand. The taking of human experience is the interface, that's the supply chain interface, the illegitimate taking of human experience, done through a one-way mirror. The idea of surveillance capitalism, that word of surveillance is not there to be melodramatic. It's not there to be provocative. It's there to be a technical description that without the social relations of the one-way mirror, this whole thing wouldn't work. Because they understood from the beginning that when people know how much you're taking, I believe, sir, last night, Alexander, you mentioned how surprised you were that people were creeped out because you took from them without asking. You took from them without informing them. You took from them without giving them the right to combat or contest, let alone the right to consent. From the very beginning of these operations, surveillance capitalists understood that when people know how much is being taken secretly, not what we think we're giving them, but what is being taken behind their backs, specifically engineered, as Facebook says, to bypass human awareness. When that veil is lifted and people get a whiff of that, they don't want any part of it. That's when the encryption conversations start. That's when, how do I hide? How do I camouflage? That's when those conversations start. So from the beginning, this whole economic logic depended on the social relations of the one-way mirror. That is a power relationship. It does two things. It extracts until you get these huge asymmetries of knowledge, and that knowledge pivots into power, because knowledge is used then to influence, ultimately to modify human action in an automated fashion, remotely, not coming to your bedroom at night to threaten murder and terror, or take you to the gulag or the camp, but through remote control mechanisms, through the medium of the digital milieu, to shift behavior in the direction that serves the commercial outcomes of surveillance capitalists and their business customers. So, law, interrupting supply. We're not talking about data ownership. Once we've talked about that, we've lost this battle. We're talking about supply at the front end. If my experience is going to be turned into data, I decide. I decide how it's used. I decide if it's shared. I decide for what purpose. That's at the front end of supply. At the end of this chain, we have demand. So how do we interrupt the incentives that drive this whole process in the first place, Rana? So that means we have to interrupt the rewards for the surveillance dividend. And the way to do that, Occam's razor, the way to do that is that we outlaw markets that trade in human futures. Because I haven't gotten into all the economic imperatives yet, but if I did, I would tell you that economies of scale, we need a ton of data. Economies of scope, we need varieties of data, but also economies of action. We need to learn how to intervene in action on a global scale, on a massive scale. And we need to learn how to gently shape action in a way that increases the predictive value of our products, economies of action. So these things are on a collision course with democracy. From below, they undermine human freedom because human autonomy is their enemy. Human agency is their enemy. Individual sovereignty is their enemy. From above, they interrupt democracy. They challenge democracy because they create a new axis of social inequality. And that is what I call epistemic inequality. These huge asymmetries of knowledge, just at a time when we expected the digital to be a democratizing force. And this is exemplified by this growing chasm between what we know and what is known about us. So, when we can interrupt supply and we can interrupt and eliminate these incentives, we then eliminate the surveillance dividend. And when we do that, we change the entire, it's not just leveling the competitive playing field, we transform this playing field. There are thousands of companies waiting in the wings, thousands of entrepreneurs and would-be startups who want to get into business, who want to do things without surveillance capitalism. But as long as in the case of Ford, I talked to you about earlier, as long as investors are being attracted to the surveillance dividend, this whole competitive thing is actually fundamentally disfigured.
Okay.
Surveillance capitalism is a market failure. And it's law that is, because it is a disconnect between supply and demand.
That's an interesting...
It's not what people want.
It's an interesting point, too, because the figures on monopoly and concentration of power would support that. Go ahead, Sherry.
I think
we're going to queue up some questions.
I think in my research and interviewing people, there's a very powerful analogy to be made between how people have not been able to look at surveillance capitalism and how they have not been able to look at the climate crisis. It's like things they haven't been able to address, things that are too big to think about, things that you can't wrap your head around, so maybe I won't because it's too hard, and after all, it's a beautiful sunny day. And after all, I'm getting these luxuries that are free on my computer, and maybe I'll focus on that. And what I've noticed in my own interview work over the past 3 years is a change, is that slowly the climate crisis is becoming something that people can begin to think about, do feel that they can take personal agency for. And the notion that I really am being sucked dry. I really am the product. I mean, this old story of, you know, that you are the you're the product. That is starting to be something that people are being able to see as a political issue, and that old, you know, how many times, I mean, I know Shoshana's heard it, we've all heard it, that horses out of the barn thing. It's becoming really uninteresting in the climate crisis because the horse may be out of the barn, but we're all gonna, you know, we're gonna die if we just keep repeating that. And people don't want to hear it anymore about surveillance capitalism either. So I think that oddly, and I'm really not naturally an optimist in these things. I mean, people have called me the Darth Vader of the, you know, kind of, at MIT, I walk into a room.
I thought you were the Margaret Mead of technology.
Right, I mean, sort of the, you know, the kind of chill when I walk into the happy engineering, you know, environment. But oddly, the sense of that you can act, and that these two crises are going to be addressed together. These two crises that almost became taboo knowledge, in the sense that people wanted to compartmentalize them and treat them as something that you couldn't think about, I think is very important.
That's fascinating. BJ, do you have any comment before we try and field a few questions here?
Yeah. I want us to define as a panel what the problem is. It's not technology. It's not mobile phone. I mean, journalists will call me and say, well, what about addiction to the mobile phone? Well, it's not the phone. It's experiences people have on the phone. And it's not all of technology that's leading to, I mean, so we're talking Google, Facebook, probably not Pinterest. I mean, who are we talking about here? It's not all technology. It's specifically, and then there's games, which is a whole different creature, I think.
Not necessarily.
Yes, but who are we? So let's define, because I think it's unhelpful to say
well, I think,
technology
Shoshana,
and mobile phone.
You would define it as an entire system of capitalism, right?
I'm
But who are the
defining it
actors?
as a logic of accumulation, an economic logic that has essentially hijacked the digital, hijacked the technology in order to achieve its commercial objectives. When we look at something like Cambridge Analytica, and what we see is the exact mechanisms and methods of surveillance capitalism pivoted toward the political domain. So rather than these methods and mechanisms, rather than to meet commercial objectives, they were pivoted to meet political objectives. And we still don't know, because the data has not been made available to the forensic scholars who ultimately will be able to tell us how much of Cambridge Analytica's political objectives they really achieved. But that was the pivot there. The key thing to understand is that Cambridge Analytica was a parasite, and it was a parasite on a host. And we think that the host was Facebook. And in the specific near term, it was Facebook. But Facebook is a leading surveillance capitalist and shares and exemplifies the economic logic of surveillance capitalism. So in fact, Cambridge Analytica was enabled. It was given the means, the data, and the opportunity by the structure and operations of surveillance capitalism.
Would you agree with that?
I like how you conceptualize it as a broader thing, but I'm still going to, throughout the discussion, say, let's not just, cast this vague technologies as the problem. I mean, I would.
But that's not what she's saying. She's saying
right, right. But I'm still going to, because I think if you can't define the problem specifically, and you're defining it, I love how you talk about this. But still, everyday people are thinking, my kid's playing games all the time, that's a problem. Wow, I'm at work and I'm just feeling like I need to get on Facebook, or people
well, let me
are on the
ask
beach
you,
with,
actually, let me ask you a different question, because, I'm one of the people that complain about my kids being, their attention being hijacked by phones. Your student, Tristan Harris, who's written and talked about this topic, has a new center, the Center for Humane Technology. He believes that a lot of this problem can be solved by tweaks in the design systems of these devices. I mean, I'm curious, what do you think about what he's put forward? And Sherry, what do you think about this? Do you want to be more discreet about it, the way BJ is talking, or do you want to be more global, the way Shoshana's talking?
I think it's a more global problem, actually. I mean, I think I think that tweaking is good. I mean, I think that education is good, tweaking is good, training people to be more literate about what they're doing and what they're seeing. I mean, all of that is good. But I define this problem for me as a kind of, and the reason I talk so much about human vulnerability, and this is something I share with Tristan, is that you have an industry that basically is saying, and this is not just in the surveillance capitalist area, but in the creation of artificial companionship in general, or phones that engross you, that's saying, engage with us, abide with me, And that will bring joy, fulfillment, companionship, connection. Abide with me. And then you're going to be meeting me and other psychologists this afternoon that are going to be showing you how empathy levels go down, depression levels go up during the period in which these technologies, to which we're very vulnerable, are around.
Well, let me
BJ,
ask-
last
Wait,
words
wait,
to you.
wait a
Let
second,
me-
wait a second.
let me answer the question.
Let me just finish. And then the technologists say, and many of these are my closest colleagues, I know what to do. I'm going to write empathy apps for the iPhone.
Right.
And that's where my moral compass says no.
Okay.
Creating technologies to solve the, creating tweaks and creating technology tweaks to be the empathy apps for technology that has taken away some of your empathy, that is not the solution.
Not working for you.
We are the empathy app. People talking to each other, we are the empathy app.
You're
So
not.
that's how I would try to reframe this at the highest level, that we need to get back to the idea that it is our job to be each other's empathy app.
Let me ask you, should we have an FDA of tech?
I think that's a good idea. Let me answer the question about Tristan, because
Yeah.
it's been mischaracterized. Shoshana was my student, I think, in 2006, same year that Mike Krieger, the co-founder of Instagram, was my student, same class. And he never actually worked in my lab, despite what people have said. He was a student in my class, but we stayed in touch. I love what he's doing, and I've always been a supporter of him. But the difference, to answer your question, the only thing we really differ on, Tristan and I, is how to look at and address the problem. He talks a lot about the business model is set up the wrong way. And I'm like, yeah, but I can't do anything about the business model. I know I can help people change behavior. So I look at it like, who's having a problem with what? And how do we help people figure out what they can do in their homes, what they can do as individuals to reduce their vulnerability? So my approach, I think of everything in terms of behavior. And Shoshana, what you're talking about in the policy level, I totally agree with. I'm not very smart at that, and I don't know how to influence it. In 2006, the FTC invited me to be on a panel about what the dangers of technology. I testified on the panel in 2006, and I said, here are the 3 problems, and one of them was capturing of individual data and then using it against people. I got one kind of trivial question and 0 follow-up.
Why do you think?
Because I guess people were not feeling that that was a problem at the time. And who knows why, it just puzzled me. It's like 2006, I went, shone a spotlight on 3 issues. And one was this collection of personal information. I called it persuasion profiling. What companies are doing and what we'll do more and more is collecting data from us, and they will buy and sell those profiles, and they will use it in these ways. And one of the ways I said in elections, and I forgot that for years, and I went back and listened. I talked about videos that would be manipulated. I guess now we call those deep fakes. I said there's going to be videos, and our human brain's going to say that's true, but they're not. And the third was about video games and what was going to go on. I said, these are the emerging problems. And so it was frustrating to me. And so I'd had conferences, I'd published papers on some of these dangers and downsides, and then the opportunity to talk to policymakers, and nothing. And I was like, okay, just go back to my work. Just go back to my work. Yeah.
I don't want to ignore the audience. You guys are so scintillating that I haven't been able to come up for air, but let's cue this up in a few minutes and get a couple questions in. Let's take 2 questions at a time, actually, and then one from that side, whatever. And we've got like 7 minutes, and then we're going to have a break, and then you guys are going to be able to come back, I think, for a half hour or so, if time allows, and we'll get more in. So let's hear one question, and then let's hear another from that side.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. My name is Camilo Arias. I study right here at the University of Chicago, and I'm an incoming Siebel scholar. My question would be, let me take my book so I don't miss anything, about the consequences of these persuasive technologies or surveillance capitalism that can even approach the consequences of slave market, right? And then my question would be, are these consequences homogeneous, or are they differentiated by demographics or socioeconomic status?
It's a great question.
And then if we were to test these consequences, what differences should we expect to see between a country with a very high penetration as the US, and a different country, a developing country that, while it's every year more into the digital markets, is definitely has less penetration than the US?
Love that question. Should we get anybody want to field that one? Shoshana, you want to take it?
So your first question was, are the consequences distributed unjustly? Am I right?
Yeah.
And what about the sort of regional spread, into Latin America, for example, and Asia and Africa and so forth? Yes? Yeah. Okay. So,
by the way, while you're queuing up, check out Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which actually has a lot of interesting case studies in the US about how the consequences of all this play out in different socioeconomic groups. Go ahead.
all right, so.
But let me clarify the question a little bit. Do you mean the consequences or people's vulnerabilities being different? Because I think those are different things. The consequences would be like the effects, and vulnerability is about who's susceptible.
I guess if you're more vulnerable, you'll be more harmed by the system?
Okay, I liked how you said it, like, the inequality of, okay.
Camilo, may I ask where you're from?
I'm from Mexico.
Mexico. Fantastic. So nice to meet you. So I was wondering if you ran into this headline just from last week. City workers saw homeless people lined up to get $5 gift card for face scan uploaded to Google.
Yeah.
You see that headline last week? Okay. So here's why the discussion about data ownership is a discussion that the surveillance capitalists would like us to have, but how its consequences we can anticipate are highly unjust, are likely to be highly unjust, right? The idea of data ownership seems to have face validity. We think, well, I'm giving them some of my data, and if I want it back, I should be able to get it back. It should be mine, right? It came from me. But what we fail to understand are two things. One is we think that the data that we're giving is the data that they have about us. But that's not true. The data that we're giving is just a tiny fragment of the data that they have about us because, as I said, surveillance capitalism, they're hunting and capturing data from every aspect and every angle, from our voices or how we walk down the street and if our shoulders are stooped. They like our faces because they want to capture the muscles in our face because those can be translated by affective computing into emotional states. Emotional states are highly predictive. They're taking data from every aspect. So data ownership is something that the leading surveillance capitalists have become comfortable with because they've got a lot of law firms figuring out how they can pay the minimum amount just for that little bit of data that we gave them and not have to pay anything for the trillions of data points that are ingested every hour in Facebook's AI hub or the 6 million predictions of human behavior per second produced in Facebook's AI hub, okay? So here is a visceral example of this. I've been saying, as I've been speaking out there about this book for the last 10 months, data ownership is the recipe for a new underclass, right? This is why we outlaw markets that trade in human organs, because we don't want people who are financially disadvantaged to sell their kidney in order to feed their kids, right? But this is what's happening with data ownership, and it's already begun. So here we have Google paying a subcontractor to round up homeless people to actually lie to them about what's going on. The managers pressure them to maximize their collections by targeting cash-strapped participants such as homeless people and college students, rushing them through the consent agreement and positioning the scan as a mini game or new app that needs testing. So they didn't even know that they were giving away their faces. All right? So this is one example, Camilo. I know I'm not giving you all examples, but this is one example where clearly people who are disadvantaged, whether it's educationally, financially, you know, because they're not speaking the language, or whatever it may be, people who are already struggling in our deeply polarized society, in a society already scarred by economic inequality, are that much more vulnerable to the consequences here, whether it's collecting so much data about you without your awareness that can then come back and deny you mortgage and deny you credit and these other things, or take your face, and then your face ends up in the law enforcement facial recognition operations.
Which, by the way,
this just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right, of targeting people who are defenseless in the first place, right? So there is deep injustice already baked into this cake. May I just quickly answer the regional thing? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
We're at time, but go ahead quickly.
All right. So as far as moving around the world, they're very anxious to move around the world. Latin America is an important target. Africa is an important target. And that's because if there's no law here, there's even less law there. And in addition, there are so many people without availability to functioning institutions, the unbanked, the uneducated, right? So, so these folks need that, they need the services that can be delivered through a phone. They need those mobile services, and they need them to survive, right? They need them to get their crops out. They need them to get their crops to market. They need them to do basic economic participation kinds of functions. And that level of need, going back to Sherry's important theme of vulnerability, makes them vulnerable, and therefore the supply chain interfaces, are frictionless, because you can just, give away Androids and get people on these apps and get their financial life embedded in these apps, and then the behavioral surplus is flowing with no friction, no impediment, internal or external.
Let me, we're gonna have to hold off on the second question until after the networking break, but I also want to flag a couple of things. In my new book, there's a whole chapter looking at surveillance policing, and that's being done already in the US, and there's, in ways that I think really violate civil liberties. I also want to say on geography, and I'm hoping in the next panel, perhaps in this one, but certainly in the next one, we can talk a little bit about the ways in which different parts of the world are heading in different directions with surveillance capitalism, with regulation. China going in an entirely different direction. The EU, we don't know yet. The US, not sure. 5G being a big part of this. And the fact that this is a major part of the trade debate and the foreign policy debate right now that's impacting our whole discussion. So with that,
I hope we can talk about that.
I'll bring this back up. But with that, queue up your questions, go have a cup of coffee, and we're going to come back in 30 minutes.